My name is Andrew Basden of the University of Salford. I'm going to be giving you an introduction to Dooyeweerd's aspects and separately to aspectual analysis as part of the workshop on digital transformation, a multi-aspectual approach. I'm going to go fairly fast through a number of things because of limited time. So first, who was Herman Dooyeweerd? He was a mid-20th century Dutch thinker who turned into a philosopher, and his philosophy had different starting points from most other philosophy. Instead of starting with theory and existing philosophy, he started with everyday life. Instead of starting with being and process, he started with meaningfulness. He started with createdness and coherence rather than autonomy and fragmentation. And he accepted the diversity that we experience in everyday life rather than trying to reduce it theoretically. This led him to identify multiple aspects of reality. I'm going to go through the aspects as the bulk of this talk. There are 15 that he delineated as a kind of provisional best guess as to the ways in which reality could be meaningful. Each aspect is a sphere of meaning and law. It has a kernel meaning and a constellation of meaning around it. On the next screen, I will show you the kernel meanings. But I'm going to go through each aspect in turn with a little bit more detail, with some examples of how it relates to digital transformation. So the kernel meanings. There is amount, an extension, movement, energy, life, feeling, distinction, forming, signification. What you might notice is that these three aspects are to do with material, plants and animals. These three are to do with the thinking human individual. These are social aspects, and these are aspects of society, and these are mathematical aspects. Okay. Each aspect can define a type of thing, the sort of things that we experience in everyday life. So let's go through these aspects one by one. First of all, the quantitative aspect is to do with amount, if you like, number, one, many, more or less. And I'm going to, for each aspect, I'll show you what that aspect offers to reality. So it offers the idea of amount and of sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. In digital transformation, we might talk about the amount of transformation. The spatial aspect is to do with extensiveness, extending over space. To do with proximity, shape, overlap, and it's continuous, and there's simultaneity in that. Take a triangle, for instance. Its three sides are there at the same time. In digital transformation, we might be thinking about geographical distribution. That's one of its spatial aspects. Movement is the kinematic aspect. Things like velocity and route and flow. What it offers reality is continuous change. And its relevance to digital transformation might be the movement of data around the system and between system and users. Now, I will occasionally break in and say something about aspects in general, and at the kinematic aspect I'm going to introduce the idea of the good that each aspect introduces into reality that previous aspects cannot predict. The kinematic aspect introduces the idea of continuous movement, whereas the spatial aspect was static and the quantitative aspect was discrete. And neither this quantitative nor the spatial aspect have any idea of continuous movement. It was introduced by the kinematic. So look out for the good that each aspect introduces. The physical aspect introduces energy, which is also force, mass, light, heat, pressure, friction, all these sort of things. The good that it introduces into reality is the idea of causality and irreversible arrow of time. A couple of things that where the physical aspect might be relevant to digital transformation. Power cuts. What are we going to do in the event of power cuts? And a very different physical aspect is climate change emissions. The biotic aspect is to do with life, or to do with organism and cells and so on, and things that keep us alive, like feeding, excreting, that keep us healthy, and the cycle of birth, growth, maturity and death. The good that it introduces into reality is the idea of entities that can exist within an environment and maintain themselves separately from their environment by autopoiesis, reproduction and things like that. With this aspect comes in the possibility of a negative. Instead of health, we might have disease. And these will be in grey. In digital transformation, we might consider how the transformation affects the health of people involved, or conversely, whether health of people affects the transformation, and in particular pandemics. By the way, growth and things like maturity are often used as metaphors of businesses or systems, but they are not biotic aspect. They are an analogy of the biotic, but I won't be saying much more about those. With the biotic aspect, let's introduce the idea of functioning repercussion. Every aspect, each aspect, allows us to function. And as we function in each aspect, repercussions occur that are meaningful in that aspect. So, for example, in the biotic aspect, if we feed well, then we're likely to be healthy, and vice versa. The sensory aspect, or the psychical aspect, is to do with feeling, like hearing and sound, being alert, hunger, fear, stimulus response, and mental apparatus like recognition and memory. It introduces the possibility of interaction between entities, and a negative is torpidity or insensitivity. Which brings us to digital transformation. Is it suited to those who are visually or orally impaired, or perhaps those with memory problems like dyslexia? We should consider those. The analytic aspect is to do with distinction. It's to do with concepts, logic, analysis, theory, and so on. We distinguish things and we think independently. Now listen, just listen. What do you hear? You probably hear things like fan noise or traffic noise or something like that, of which you weren't aware until I drew your attention to it. You were hearing them in the sensitive aspect, but you are functioning in the analytic aspect to make distinction between what you paid attention to and what you ignored. So, in the digital transformation, does it have clear goals? Its data, is it clearly defined? Then, in its use, does it help people think, or does it confuse people? The formative aspect is to do with forming, structure and planning and goals, innovation. It's to do with tools and techniques and technologies. The good it introduces is achievement. We can achieve things, and what prevents achievement is laziness, destruction and chaos. we might ask about a digital transformation. What is its overall purpose? What is it trying to achieve? What is each part trying to achieve? Each task? What's the technology used? And what does it enable users to achieve or other people to achieve? And what does it hinder? At this point, let's have introduced the idea of target aspect. Our functioning in each aspect usually targets other aspects, and so on the next screen we'll have a number of target aspects from our formative functioning. So we are forming something, but what do we form? We can form clay into pots, physical aspect. Concepts into nets, words into sentences, roles into organisation, we form beliefs. Those are our targets. Lingual aspect is to do with signification or signing, using signs, expressing, reading, writing, speaking, hearing, the signs and symbols. It enables us to externalize meanings so that they can be picked up later on. And the norm is understandability as opposed to deceit or misunderstanding. So in digital transformation, the word digital, in fact, is to do with information. So the lingual aspect is particularly important, but it's also important in communication, both in the development phase and in use. The social aspect is to do with we, or agreeing with shared activity, or relating to each other, or pointing roles in institutions and organisations. The good that it introduces is that we work better together as a group rather than just a number of individuals, and aloofness and enmity are its negatives. So in digital transformation we might ask, what roles are involved in development and in use? What is the agreement on the transformation? Cultural assumptions are, if you like, cultural agreements about what is true. And there are many other social aspects. The aspects depend on each other inherently. Most functioning in an aspect depends on good functioning in other aspects. So, for example, the social aspect depends on good lingual functioning, good communication. That itself depends on good formative functioning, that is, structuring our thoughts into sentences, and analytic aspect, having clear thoughts, and so on. The economic aspect is to do with frugality, resources. It's not to do so much with money, although these things come in, but it's more fundamentally to do with management of limited resources. Value and currency are just one part of the economic aspect. The good it introduces is the ability to have sustainable prosperity, as opposed to waste or destitution. Obviously, for digital transformation, the costs involved are an economic aspect. But there's also other resources like skills and deadlines. And we have to consider, what is the impact of the transformation on the resources, perhaps of time, of users, or resources of the world? These are often overlooked in the planning, in the haste to bring in digital transformation. The aesthetic aspect is to do with harmony, as in an orchestra or a symphony. So that leads us to an idea of integration and the idea of holism, but it also leads to enjoyment, surprise, beauty, interest, fun, style, rest, leisure and comfort, art and sport. And the negatives are these things like snobbery and revulsion and fragmentation. So about the digital transformation, we might ask its harmony with its context and its internal harmony. We might ask, what's it like to use? Juridical aspect is to do with due, to do with rightness, proportionality, responsibilities, contracts, rewarding and punishing, It brings in the idea of a justice and appropriateness, not just behaviour, and its opposite is injustice and inappropriateness. In digital transformation, we have to ask, in what jurisdictions does the transformation occur? How does it fit in with them? And in development of the digital transformation, we should never cut corners. This brings in the idea of aspects as a foundation. You might have noticed how for each aspect we've given examples of things, activities, properties, abstract things, institutions. Meaningfulness is a foundation of all of these, and aspects give types of each of these. The second last aspect that we're going to use is self-giving love, the ethical aspect, which is things like mercy and forgiveness, generosity, openness, self-sacrifice. It brings extra goodness into the world. It undoes evil. It not just neutralizes, but overcomes evil. The opposite of self-giving love, of the ethical, is not wrong. This is not hate. It's selfishness, self-protection, competitiveness. So the question for digital transformation, does it bring real good to others? Or is it there just to benefit certain sectors of society? Perhaps the techies or the senior management. Finally, the faith aspect. Pistis means faith, vision, commitment. Is a Greek word. Belief. So it's to do with things like certainty and commitment and faithfulness, aspirations, assumptions, presuppositions, religion and ideology. A good that it brings in is courage and motivation and loyalty, and the negatives are the opposites. Also idolatry. Digital transformation, any transformation, needs a bit of courage. But remember the ethical aspect. It should not just be courage to bring in transformation for its own sake. That is idolatry. It should be for the sake of the good of others, the ethical aspect. Then it's not idolatry. Idolatry, one of my students is studying it in relation to electronic government, seen as transformative government, and many e-government projects have failed because of what he identifies as idolatry, of saying, we want this just for its own sake. It serves itself, everything else is sacrificed to it, it delivers the opposite of what it promises. And that's often the case with other transformations. Because of retrocipation, the opposite of anticipation, functioning in a later aspect affects and shapes that in earlier aspects. So the pistic, being the last aspect, affects all the others. What we fundamentally believe will determine, for example, how we speak, the social aspect, the juridical aspect. The ethical and pistic aspect are often the most important reasons why digital transformation fails, especially because of the idolatry of technology. I'm going to give a brief summary of the normativity of the aspects. You can see that each has a good and an evil or a negative, and these yellow ones are where these aspects have good without any negative, and these can be considered during analysis of digital transformation. If we function well in all the aspects, we get what the Hebrew word shalom means, which is a kind of prosperity, well-being, peace in the whole of life. The Arabic word salam, I believe, means the same thing. But if we function negatively in any aspect, it undermines a shalom, or if you like, success of digital transformation. And we'll later think of how these aspects can help us on a roadmap to success. I want to say something very briefly about a digital system. You might have noticed that we have talked about a number of different ways about aspects of a system. We have talked about aspects of development of the digital system, aspects of its use, aspects of its features, aspects how it relates to society and its responsibility for things like climate change. These are 4 major areas of concern in the information systems or digital systems field. In the handout, I mentioned a book I wrote that came out in 2018, and in chapters 6 to 9 I discuss how aspects can help us understand each of these in some depth. As we go through the exercises later, don't worry whether your aspects are about development, use, features or society. Just think of aspects and we can separate them out later. So thank you very much for listening.